My name's Joan Donovan, and I'm a professor of journalism and emerging media studies here at the Com College. This is my first event at EU, so this is kind of exciting for me. I've only started working here like 2 months ago, so they've been good to me, so it's been fun. I wanted to introduce the panel, and then we're gonna chat for about 20 minutes, and then y'all are gonna be able to ask questions of the folks up here. To my side here is one of my best and oldest mentors, Gabriella Coleman, who's written some amazing books about computing and alternative spaces online, particularly the way in which the anonymous movement or ensemble, as you call them, came together and caused quite a bit of mischief in the early aughts and later through 2010s. And she's been continuing to study the rise of the far right and little a anonymous, not capital A anonymous, online. So questions that would be good for here about the roles of anonymity and how design factors into the kinds of behaviors that people think they can get away with online. And so just trying to prime the pump here for when we go into Q&A. To her side here is Eleni Castro, who is the Director of Digital Ventures here at Boston University. He's got a lab in a building about a block from here.
Yep.
And not only being one of my best friends for the past 25 years or so, Eleni is a big reason why I came to BU because of her work on digital archiving and bringing the old world of media into the present. And so she has to make decisions every day about, well, do we just archive everything on YouTube and put everything in Dropbox and hope people can find it? And so she's very attuned to the way in which the internet has changed information studies, librarianship, and if you caught it at the end, someone made a comment about YouTube being a library in and of itself, and I think we can debate that topic. And then on the end, a weirdo that just walked in.
Just following you around all week.
Yeah, he was hanging out at the Starbucks earlier, can't get rid of him. This is Alex Winter, brilliant director, has made several documentaries about technology and community, also has made some interesting narrative movies and some weirdo music videos in the 90s, some really interesting stuff. And
80s even.
80s even. So he went to NYU Film School, and but it's been interesting to spend so much time with the film and with Alex the past few days, because for me, I saw the film and I thought, this looks like my research. And weirdly, when we were talking, he said, oh, I was very inspired by this paper. You saw Becca Lewis in there, who Biella and I have a very special relationship to that research she had been doing on the Alternative Influence Network, because we were both affiliated with Data and Society at the time, looking at small networks that were having a huge impact on the culture. So I'm just going to open up and ask these two fine ladies to my side to give some reaction to the video and to the movie we just saw, the documentary, and how, you know, it brought up certain tensions in your own work.
Thanks, Joan. So a couple of things. So beyond just my work as an information scientist, as a librarian, someone that thinks about archiving our cultural heritage, it impacted me as a parent. What I was never prepared for was my child to tell me they want to be a YouTuber, an 8-year-old, right? Like, that's where all her friends look at media. They don't think about television. They don't even care about Netflix or Apple Plus, whatever they call it these days. So I never was prepared to understand, hey, parental guidance, I have to watch this thing with her all the time and explain to her what's going on. Because in school, they're not teaching them media literacy, digital information literacy. And I don't know how much of it is taught even in middle school or high school, Alex.
0.
See, there you go. So as a parent, it all falls on you to teach your kids about this stuff. And that's scary because not every parent has the capacity or the time to do that.
Or the understanding.
Exactly.
They don't have the media literacy they need to convey to their kids.
So how do we start that? Like, how do we start at the beginning of K through 12 to teach these things to educators? The Wheelock College over here, are they helping the teachers of tomorrow to do that stuff, right? So, and as an information scientist, people talk about the public library, right? That this is the public library of the world, that it's an archive. That's a myth, because YouTube can take stuff down whenever they want, or whenever whenever the algorithm or the machine learning mechanisms say this is copyright protected material. In fact, I took a copyright course from Harvard, which had used fair use. Fair use allows you to use a certain amount as long as you can explain it, and they took it down. And the lawyers are saying, no, it's legal. So that's how this documentary has impacted me in ways that, maybe other folks hadn't thought about it like that. But, yeah.
Along with kind of working on kind of hacker cultures and activist communities, Joan did not mention that I was an anthropologist.
Oh, yeah, that old thing. She works at Harvard, but I don't talk about that.
No, and it just matters because I think, especially, thanks for putting this film together, because I actually do love YouTube and the internet, and there really is a tension between everything that the internet can offer in so many different arenas, and then some of the harms that also come with it, right? But I think something like YouTube, where you're getting thrown all these videos, all this content, doesn't replace something like a well-made movie or a book that can kind of tell a story in a more nuanced and deep way, right? But we live in a world where both sort of media and mediums exist. And as an anthropologist, who works on technology as well, and one who has the kind of long view where I've been looking at this stuff since around the late 90s to the present, I feel myself ambivalent around how to deal with some of these problems. Yeah. And there was a moment in the movie that I loved, which was the interview with Zuckerberg and the Google CEO, which I don't know his name.
Sundar.
And Dorsey.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And I hate to admit it, but I agree with the CEO's answer. It's complicated.
Yeah.
It's not just like yes or no, right? And I'm just going to put my cards on the table right away, where I say many of the problems that come with YouTube, whether it's like the explosion of conspiracy theories or hate crimes, I actually do think that the problem is far more complicated, and you can't just blame YouTube, right? If you just got rid of YouTube, you'd still have a lot of these problems. And I love, as an anthropologist, to think about some of the non-technological factors that feed into that. But I do think that these companies have to be held accountable. They make so much money.
Yeah.
And what they can do, they have to do,
Yeah.
right? And that's one of the things that really comes out kind of clearly in the movie.
Yeah.
When you're making $15 billion, right, you may not, in fact, by changing the algorithm and tweaking a number of things, get rid of all the problems. But if it does help, whether that's 5%, 10%, 15%, you better do that. So anyways, that was one of my, many, many, many reactions I had to the film.
You want to react?
Yeah. Just taking yours first. What's interesting, obviously I've known your work for a really long time. We've interacted over the years.
On social media.
On social media,
Although
yeah.
YouTube maybe.
Yeah, and through some mutual anonymous friends. But that's always been my approach to the tech space as well, which is how I've ended up with the access that I have. The people in the tech community that know me, because obviously not all of them do, know that I'm not tech averse, right? That I feel sort of my thesis is very similar to what you just described, which is of course, and this makes it very easy for big tech and for governments to a degree to not do anything.
That's right.
Right? Because it's easy for them to say, well, it's a society problem, because of course it's a society problem, rampant inequality, misogyny, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ and other marginalized groups, inherent biases. These are just part of entrenched power, right? They're just the world that we live in.
Well, let me ask you a question actually about misogyny, because one of the stories that comes out right at the beginning is that YouTube was supposed to replicate in video this website called Hot or Not, which also is, the villain origin story of Facebook, which is that Zuckerberg wanted a place where he could rate other people at Harvard, other women at Harvard, and that was the original software. How does misogyny affect innovation? If because I'm also thinking about the original business of the internet, which was pornography.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah, but also, not that we'll drag them into a granular discussion of the evolution of Silicon Valley, but shouldn't be lost on you that where Steve was working at the time that he did this was PayPal, right? Under Thiel and Musk. This is the bedrock of the misogyny that underlies all of Silicon Valley and grew like a seed into every form of tech that we use today.
But so now I'm going to be like the person that complicates this narrative as well, because one of the interesting things about this history is, first let me ask a question. Who here has heard of indie media? Okay, so like a few people. It was formed in 1999 by a bunch of activists and hackers who were concerned with the biases in the mainstream media. And it was a time where you could use the internet, but it was incredibly hard to post video and images, especially kind of in a collective way. And many of these hackers created these content management systems that really allowed activists in different cities around the world to upload video and images and text kind of instantaneously to showcase the protests against the World Trade Organization, right? Many of those people actually ended up doing a lot of the technological innovations at companies like Twitter and Flickr and YouTube as well, right? Yeah. And so there's a way in which, the kind of innovation around getting this stuff online is as much part of progressive communities that then get erased, but then there's these like tech moguls, right? That then really have the power to steer these companies, right? Yep. And I just want to disaggregate the two, because both I want to kind of honor where some of these innovations came from, and also just, it's so complicated, because I do feel like having these media out there in terms of being able to post videos and photos is very powerful.
It is, but that was sort of what we were dealing with the Napster story, was that what I love about the internet, and I think what probably most people love about the internet, even if they're not tech savvy, is the fact that they know they can bolt their way into it, right? Like where the original hacking term comes from. Like, people like Justin Frankel, like people who were innovating like back in the early 90s that got JPEGs online, that originally got music online in whatever form of audio. These weren't coming from giant tech. Sean Fanning, as I said, was just he was a college dropout who was living in his uncle's closet in Hull. And they innovated technologies that gave rise to a lot of what we use today. There was a lot of amazing people within the internet that do that. But I think the point I'm just trying to make, which is why Google was such a focus for me in this story, sort of goes back to what Biela was saying about the fact that there's a lot of smoke screens being thrown up to allow for some pretty onerous business models to exist in order to create profit. And so there is a line between what those companies say they can't do in terms of content moderation or their business model, what the government rightly sometimes says about free speech, because they often get it wrong when it comes to technology, like what is a free speech issue in terms of the internet and what actually isn't a free speech issue can get very muddy. But most of the time, these really big companies are just trying to hold on to profit. and they don't want to do anything that impinges on that profit model. And I think that those, for me, because I also love YouTube, and all three of my boys, I've never taken them off platform. In fact, I use it all the time. But I'm a pretty good media literacy parent.
Yeah.
But I also know, Joan and I have talked about this a lot, the highway of negativity on YouTube, considering how big YouTube is tiny. Like the amount of people on YouTube that are like, you can count the really bad apples almost on two hands. Like, if you got a kid in middle school, especially a boy, just tell them not to watch Andrew Tate and you're almost done. But I mean, there really are a handful of really bad actors that have an enormous amount of money behind them, an enormous amount of support. So it's not, I don't find it overwhelming to actually, and you teach the kids to use the library, to not use it as their encyclopedia, blah, blah, blah. But there are really negative business practices involved that are causing harms that we could fix that aren't getting fixed.
Yeah, very true. So I am going to kick it back to you in a minute. But I wanted to ask you, Eleni, about, this is something that's just bothered me forever, which is, like, why don't we have an enormous digital public library?
Yeah.
Right? And what are the impediments to that? I think about it in terms of Spotify's infrastructure.
Yeah.
Couldn't that be retooled so that we have access to everything that's in the commons? Couldn't we retool YouTube to be a place that, like, what other kind of rules would have to be instantiated to stand it up so that it is a cultural institution and isn't just this for-profit churn and burn, content machine?
Oh, Joan, it's complicated. But honestly, there have been organizations that have tried to do that, right? Like the Internet Archive. But not even the Internet Archive can do YouTube. Their terms, you would violate their terms of service, right? The Library of Congress is archiving tweets, and especially because of presidents and politicians. Joan, you have another project I know you're working on for those kinds of textual forms of social media. But video costs a lot to store.
Yeah.
And the copyright is complicated because you have music, you have video. You now are also using other clips, right?
Yeah.
I know you probably know better than I do how hard it is to license things.
Yeah.
So that's probably one of the reasons why you don't have a whole public library of video that is freely available and will always be available.
We barely have public libraries in terms of the lack of funding.
Exactly, and that's taxpayer money that funds these. YouTube is all ad sponsored material. So, and their terms of service make it that they can take it down if somebody complains, or, well, not all the time, actually, as we saw with the father in your documentary. I am optimistic, though, that there are ways through legislation that that Congress could, hopefully, if they can just, finally decided on a speaker, but that they can actually ask for at least the public records, right? So what for politicians, for presidents, that they can be archived at the National Archives or at the Library of Congress. And we can start with that. I don't know what other folks here think, but.
Yeah, I mean, just in the entertainment industry, exactly what you said with your first comment was it was really clear to those of us in the business who actually were relatively tech savvy that everybody's excitement about everything moving online was not suspect, but was going to be short-lived. And you kind of tried to explain to people, like, no, this is not an archival project. Like, they're going to turn your stuff off at some point and it will be gone.
Yeah.
And there was a service before Criterion called Filmstruck that I think was actually even partly owned by Criterion Channel. And all the art movies that ever existed suddenly appeared on Filmstruck, and everybody in the film business was so excited. And we were like, oh, guys, this is not going to end well. And sure enough, Filmstruck went under, and it all evaporated. And directors whose work didn't exist in print anymore were like, I don't have a copy of this. That was where my copy was.
Wow.
And so it really woke the industry up to fast forward now to what we've just gone through with the entertainment strike, where HBO's like, oh, we're closing down HBO. We're going to turn off Westworld, that show that you like. And it's just gone.
Yeah.
And like all the actors are like, their residuals are gone and their show is gone and their fans can't watch it. And everyone's like, wait, what? The internet's not forever?
Yeah.
So I think it's actually been a wake-up call to both the industry and the public that they can't rely on these platforms to actually preserve anything.
Yeah, the preservation principle that we used to work under, this idea that everything will be there forever, is, it deteriorates, it disappears. Some people might not think it's important because millions of people aren't watching it, and so on and so forth. So Lena is going to run around with the microphone so that we can capture this for the audio for the camera, so that the comm department can promote this and
And
archive it, but also like buy nice snacks for you all, etc. So, and also round of applause. Lena saved my butt so many times, and
So who has a question? Got one over here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. My question is for Alex. I really loved this film as someone that sat in their bedroom when I was 12 and just watched YouTube for hours on end. I thought that this was super cool to see this 10 years later. My question is, I was wondering how you chose which YouTubers and influencers to have in a film, and if there was anyone that you wanted in the film that you didn't get a chance to speak to.
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. I know a lot of influencers. I've even mentored some, like the Fine brothers worked for me right out of high school, and I helped kind of shove them towards the internet when they were teenagers. But kind of with all my docs, I'm really interested in people, it's almost like coming from narrative, like they're my cast, and they need an emotional connection to the story, and they need a willingness to be vulnerable and to kind of open themselves up about their experiences with whatever the topic is. So I didn't want just anybody. And I also wanted people who would somehow, I didn't need to be super mercenary about this, but I wanted people who kind of intersected a bit. So someone like Natalie would have been the big loss if I didn't get, there were certain people who if I didn't get, it would have been a very big loss because there's only one Natalie Wynn, right? And she's really a force of nature. And what she's managed to achieve on sort of any digital platform with ContraPoints is seminal. And it was exactly what I wanted to talk about in the movie. And the fact that she had inadvertently saved Caleb Kane's life, basically, without them ever having met, I started to build cast around those connections. Someone like Ryan Kaji was really important to me to get. I could have probably found someone else, but there was nobody as seminal as Ryan, but also who had parents who were like, look, we've gotten really rich off of this, but we were also very concerned about the lack. They were really honest about their concerns about the lack of regulation in a space that had that had made them a fortune many times over. So I'm looking for good stories, but people who are willing to tell those stories. I don't think there was really anyone I didn't get that I really wanted. There was probably a few ancillary people here and there, but I also was interested in not having the experts on camera. So I was going after people like Becca, people who I knew whose work had really moved me in that space. But then again, that I also knew would be open to discussing this stuff. It's the hardest part of making a doc. But I don't think I've ever made a doc where I thought the film didn't end up as good as I wanted because I didn't get X person. Other than Lars in my downloaded doc. That was the one that got away.
Yeah, Lars was the drummer.
How do you make a NAFTA doc without having Lars in there, right?
Yeah.
And he said yes, and then he backed out. So it was quadruply painful.
Yeah.
But other than
He
Lars,
regrets it.
yeah,
for sure.
well, yeah, I'm sure he just didn't want to step into that circus again. But in this, I really got everyone I wanted. So I was very,
That's nice.
very happy with that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm George. One of the things that I found super compelling about it is that it's there's this big tonal shift in the beginning, middle of it, and it feels like a bomb's just being dropped on you. Kind of like when you go down an internet rabbit hole, but that transition from YouTube is connecting the world to YouTube is a beast that feeds on evil. How do you, so I see, I would guess that you already had like an intention of making that transition. I mean, after all, the film's called The YouTube Effect.
Mhm.
But how do you make that transition within the documentary so gracefully?
Thank you. That was intentional. It was what I was aiming to do, though, was kind of twofold. One was structural, to do exactly what you just said, which is sort of take you sort of on a roller coaster that kind of went up and up and up and up and then stopped and then just plummeted for an hour. But it was also tied to, like, my tech talks are always sort of informed by the aesthetic of the platform itself. So like when we did Downloaded, we literally bought, like, 'cause we made it in like 2012, we went and bought a bunch of old CRT monitors and we literally remade the internet of the 90s for the movie, went to enormous pains to create that aesthetic. And the sound, everything was pulled from that time. And so I felt like, this may sound a little heady, but it's not an honest answer because there's a lot of film students in here. For me, I wanted the film to encompass the experience of the tech rise itself, and that's how it was. Like, it was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Oh, look, cat videos. Oh, holy shit, neo-Nazis, right? That's what it was. Like, for those of us who kind of came up on the early days of the internet, that experience was kind of vertiginous. And I really wanted the audience to experience that sense of vertigo of, like, you get pulled in, and then the next thing you know, you're just kind of sucked along this current. So it was always kind of the intention to have a first act that then just shot you out of a cannon into act two, basically.
The microphone.
And I can hear, too. Like, I don't want to make you run around.
Sorry. The camera.
Okay.
It's all good. You want to hand it to the woman in front? Here we go.
Thank you.
Got it.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Maddie. My question is for all of you, I guess. So, and as you all mentioned, there was a new speaker elected today. I kind of was wondering if you could expand upon how YouTube has changed government, especially as young voters are, like, we're the people who grew up on YouTube and now we're voting and we have people in the House and Congress and such in legislation who grew up on YouTube and, like, how that's affected.
Maybe you would answer that. I mean, I don't study this closely, but I will say that I do think that there's a way in which, while there's been, massive polarization and hate and divisions, I mean, certainly YouTube and other areas of the internet do allow people to follow politics in a very kind of close and granular way and get politicized. Just happens to be that sometimes we don't like how they're getting politicized, right? And I just mention that because I think that it is, important to sort of think about the fact that I think there was a moment, in 2016 where the far right was good at recruitment and changing hearts and minds,
Yeah.
right? And that is a really important strategy. But nevertheless, I do think it is interesting that you can, follow things in a way that was just much harder before when it was like NBC and C-SPAN or something,
Yeah.
right? But I think Joan has very particular answers here.
So I've been watching neo-Nazi YouTube since a long time. And some of the things that I noticed and we wrote about in the book Meme Wars is about how people would come onto YouTube and they might be a makeup influencer and then their audience would ask them, well, what do you think of Black Lives Matter? Right? And then they're like, well, I don't think about it. But the next day, another audience person in the comments saying, well, what do you think about this issue? So you have these beauty bloggers and people coming on to talk about video games that slowly, through interacting with their audiences, start to get radicalized. They start to have polarizing opinions because you're not going to spend your time on a YouTube video being like, I'm lukewarm about this, that, or the other thing. You have to have an opinion. On Instagram, you're not posting the, nice bowl of spaghetti you had that was kind of gross, but whatever, a little overcooked, right? You either posting about the best dinner you had or the worst dinner you had, and nothing in the middle. And when we were writing Meme Wars, it just became so overwhelming that many people were getting information about how to vote or about how to think about political wedge issues from their favorite influencers. And some of these influencers would have a dry sense of humor, they'd be ironic, they'd be funny. Not all of their opinions were disgusting, but some of them would be. And I remember the night I first heard about coronavirus. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I was listening to a YouTuber that goes by Mr. Mediker, and he started talking about, and pardon my speech here, Kung Flu, and how we needed to shut down the borders because Kung Flu was coming to America, and this is the time. It's finally gonna happen that our parties are gonna unite around no immigration, and he was telling his audience to push to shut down the borders. And then over the course of the next year, he kept saying, don't let them open the borders, don't reopen. And that small YouTuber that I was watching helped me understand the logic of a much larger movement of reopen folks that had similar political investments. Some wanted, of course, things to reopen because they couldn't work. Some wanted things to reopen because they didn't believe in COVID. But other people, particularly around the immigration issue, thought this was the moment that their movement was going to happen. And so I think YouTube has this uncanny ability to present you with opinions that you might not know you hold. And maybe you don't hold them that strongly, but you do feel the need to comment, to be part of that cycle. And of course, what was really crazy is the time I heard Trump say Kung Flu. And I was like, oh, that got to Bannon and that got up into the rest of them. So, did either of you want to make a comment on that?
I'll make a quick thing just about government. I mean, one of the things that became very significant for us while we were making the film was what was YouTube's impact on the 2020 election and the rise of disinformation and parsing out, again, to Biella's point, what of that had nothing to do with technology and what did. And that helped inform kind of so sort of a personal thesis. We don't really ram it down anyone's throat in the movie itself, that it's not really an algorithmic issue at the end of the day. I mean, there are issues about business models that are important in terms of what gets promoted. It's largely like most things about money. And what's going to make the most money in ad revenue, or what big political organization is going to fund an influencer that looks like they're golly gee whiz, I'm mom and pop, talking to you on my webcam, creating this super strong parasocial bond with you. That's not an algorithm, right? That's really about the power of media, right? And then the power of media being sort of given oxygen and force by a massive business interest who wants to profit off of that relationship. And that, in a way, I think is where, and that's a very old issue in terms of how that impacts government, because that goes back, it predates yellow journalism and the rivalry between Hearst and Pulitzer, but it's very similar to the Hearst-Pulitzer wars of the late 1800s, early 1900s, where you had two rival news monopolies that wanted to out-profit each other to try to crush the other, and the means by which they did that was propagating incredibly incendiary, largely totally false world event information that made the public frenzied with their desire to get more, and that just made them more money. There were no computers in 1905, right? So I think that's really at the heart of it, and I think that can be the heart of the danger of how it impacts governments. I think, unfortunately, with Google and YouTube, Google specifically, their lobbying power is so strong they've kind of locked up the left and right fairly equally. So we're not seeing a lot of regulation. We're not seeing a lot of decent legislation around the internet, around these issues, because there's just so much money flowing into the coffers of these various governments. I think she's back there. She's been asking for a while.
It's like Phil Donahue.
I honestly could hear all of you just fine. So,
It's good for the
video.
recording.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, you can sing a song or whatever you want to do.
Well,
Karaoke
I'm
time.
Julia. My question is for Alex. I'm a film major here, and I was curious from a filmmaking perspective. Like, I also realized that this could have been like a production thing. Is this something that you kind of brought from the ground up yourself as an independent production, or were you kind of hired to make this film? That's my first question.
Okay.
If you are, then I have another question.
I mean, I make everything from the ground up. I
Okay, that's
collaborated
awesome.
with Gail Ann Hurd, the producer, and she had an interest in doing something around YouTube and some access, but I'd been studying Google for years and was sort of waiting to make a film about the media front end.
So then I was gonna ask, like, for me, I have such a hard time with my ideas, like, things are happening maybe in the real world with documentary, and it's like, when is the right time to make something about it, because it keeps going, and like right now with all the AI stuff that's happening, like every day it seems to be getting like more and more real, more intense, and like if you had made it maybe now, then you could have had that involved. Like, what about that time that you made the film was like the right time to
Right, it's a great question. And it's actually a good question tied to why I made it and why I made it with Gail. Because, I mean, I've been working as an independent filmmaker around everything else I've done literally my whole life. Like, I started making films, little films in the 80s out of film school. Then they kept getting bigger and longer and all of that. I ended up making docs because I was writing a movie about Napster for Paramount Pictures that I was going to direct there, an actual narrative, as Napster was falling apart. But the average studio executive didn't know how to plug their computer into their phone line. So they were totally flummoxed by the idea of this story. They just thought it was cool because he was on the cover of Time magazine and they hated him. So that went into what's called turnaround, which means it just sits on the shelf forever.
Okay.
And I couldn't get it made because it was the end of kind of the independent film world. I just couldn't get it made. And to your point, I was like, but now's the right time. I got to make it now. And years would go by, and I was making other stuff, and I was so disappointed that I felt like my time had gone by. And then at one point I thought, well, why don't I make a doc about it? Because I'd written the movie. I knew everybody really well. I had all the access. And so 12 years later, I walked into Viacom and sold it in the room and was shooting Fanning 3 days later. And that was the beginning of making docs. So I say that because, like, I'm not a huge fan from a filmmaking standpoint of the auteur theory. Like, I have a lot of respect for it from a cinema studies sort of viewpoint, like from where it came out of and what its meaning is within the cinema studies community. As a director, it's total BS, right? You make films with other people, right? So even if it's my idea, like, I have collaborators, like I always hire editors on my docs, and I want them to dismantle my outline. Like, I wanted them to take my 80-page scriptment and throw it in the trash. And like, I want their ideas, right? So these are collaborations. So to your point, I'd been like circling something around Google for years, studying it, researching it, pulling down data on the rise of disinfo and neo-Nazis online. And then one day out of left field, Gail Ann Hurd, who's one of the biggest producers in Hollywood, who I did not know, called me and was like, you want to make a movie about YouTube? I was like, yes. Yes, I do. Like, it's a very particular movie about YouTube if you're interested in this version of it. But I think I can get the access we need. And then we took off on this collaboration. But she doesn't make docs, so she just said, go make your doc, and I'll, not impinge on it too much, but she's bright, so I used a lot of her expertise. So in a way, it's always fluid. Like, even making a doc is fluid. Like, the story, like, to your point, like, I can think, oh, now's the time to tell story X and get into it and go, like, with my film about the Silk Road, Deep Web, I know we have limited time, that was a Bitcoin doc. Like, I literally got funding from MGM to make a doc about Bitcoin, and I traveled the world talking to everyone who was involved in Bitcoin in 2014, like way before it became popular, 2014, 2015. But about a third of, and Silk Road was an important part of my story because that was what launched Bitcoin. That was the black market on the dark net that was selling heroin and all kinds of stuff. That was run by a very enigmatic leader. Well, I got to that leader. I got to the leader's family. I got entrenched into their defense case, and I was like, Bitcoin movie, go bye-bye. I'm now making a movie about the Dread Pirate Roberts and Silk Road and what it means to be caught in the middle of a federal criminal trial where most of the people involved don't understand the technology that they are trying you for, which is what happened in his case. Doesn't mean he didn't do crimes, but they had no clue what any of it meant. It was terrifying trial to be in for that reason. The jury and the judge had no concept of what they were talking about. So there's a fluidity to telling these stories too, where sometimes the story you think is the right story at the right time, you have to second guess and triple guess yourself.
And I feel like academia is very similar.
That's true.
You know,
You set
you
out
had-
to
you-
write a book,
Yeah.
and you write a different book.
That's right.
Hypothesis.
You have to capitalize on certain opportunities and access, and then there's certain moments, right?
And second guess your instincts. Like maybe
Yeah.
my instincts aren't right.
Right.
You know, it's like maybe my thought, because my feeling was like it's too early for a YouTube doc, and then I was like, wait a minute, COVID is kicking off. The world is insane. This is the perfect time to make it. I do think it's too early for an AI doc. Like that, I'm not doing. People have come to me for those, and I'm like, next 2 or 3 to 5 years, the world is going to get upended by these machine learning tools, and that time will come, but it's not now. I don't think. I think you'll be grabbing a tiger by the tail before there's a tail.
Very good. A couple more questions?
Also, we can talk, so if you guys need to peel out at any point, don't feel you're offending us.
Hello, my name's Catherine, and this is for anybody really, but as a journalist, I thought it was very interesting. You had mentioned children and how the world has changed through, I don't know what the right term is, but making it through like people not learning behaviors like trolling almost, like what they can do behind a screen and what they wouldn't do in real life. So bullying in real life is wrong, but I could bully someone behind the screen. How's that affected many people, I guess? Like, where do you think that would go, or how has it affected society?
Well, Eleni, you got kids. Or a kid.
That's a really tough question, right? Because I think it is on an individual level and cultural as well. So depending where you're raised, how much exposure you get to technology or not, and how old you are. Like I think of Ryan, he started doing this stuff when he was 4?
3 or 4.
3 or 4 years old, right? And some other kids might not be exposed to that till they're 12 years old and their parents give them a phone for the first time. So I have a hard time answering that question. And because there isn't in the curriculum in the United States, in Massachusetts, how to inform people on information, digital information, media literacy. And there isn't really a discussion at that level. It's hard for me to say how much it's impacted the world.
Right. There's also, not to be kind of the naysayer, but there's a lot of hysteria around the impact of the internet on children.
It doesn't have to be children. I just meant like in general. Like even adults would do stupid stuff online, like being mean or say something like they wouldn't say in real life. Almost like when you get pulled over in your car and you're like, "Hey, you!" and you say something really mean and you're not supposed to, but you say it anyway.
Well, they're monetizing incitement for sure. So the end game for these platforms is to incite you as much as possible in some way, because that excitement keeps you on platform, and that's tale as old as time about media of every stripe, including chat books. I mean, or Greek tragedy. But again, I think it goes for adults too. I think there has been a lot of hysteria and some kind of subverting of psychiatric studies about those impacts on mental health on the general populace. I think there are obvious impacts on mental health for people who are already suffering from PTSD, bipolar disorder, depression. That's a no-brainer, right? Obviously, if you're in that landscape, those are going to be very triggering for you.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, there was an American Psychiatric Association study that actually showed that their study found that most of the internet content was fairly neutral on teens. And that study was flipped in the media and literally reported as the opposite of what they found. And their reports were all like, APA study shows that children adversely affected by and they literally just didn't put their numbers in. There was a great expose on that by a couple of different tech outlets because it was sort of outrageous. But there's a kind of satanic panic going on around the internet. There's other docs that are sort of like, oh, it's all hysteria and you got to put your phone
name
down.
Names.
What's that?
You can
I'm
name
not
names.
while I'm being recorded. You know who you are. You know what you've done. And I think that does nobody any good. I really don't. I think that there are hard and fast facts that one can deal. I got 3 kids. They all came up on YouTube. They all play outside. Some like to read more than others, but I was raised on 14 hours of Abbott and Costello every day, right? I came out okay. So that's kind of part of being a kid too, is just zoning out on stuff. That's crap. So I think that there's a lot of hysteria in that space kind of generally. Yeah.
Yeah, I have just one comment about the psychology.
So I do a lot of research. I'm not a psychologist, but I've read a lot of psychological studies, and there is something that's going on with people's egos because I think it's best encapsulated by the term main character syndrome. You probably have a few friends like that. And they're like acting all the time, or everything is about getting it up on the gram, and that I grew up without social media, right? And I would be horrified if you saw pictures of me at high school parties and stage diving and acting the fool, and we used to love to get these old tube TVs and push them out the back of a van while going about 50 miles an hour in Ipswich, hypothetically. That would make a good YouTube video, right?
I think they still don't have the internet in Ipswich, though.
Yeah, they didn't have the internet in Ipswich, thank God. We didn't have cell phones either. But I think that always-on mentality, I grew up in a world where we didn't have to worry about being recorded all the time. And now I'm a professor and I'm being recorded in my classroom, so that the bureaucracy of the university can keep churning content. And I don't like it. I don't think it adds to a robust and frankly honest educational experience. You pay money to come to a university and you want as free a discussion as you can have within reason, but you also don't want the fear of that showing up somewhere on the internet, right? And I think this idea though of main character syndrome is so important for us to understand about how young people raised with social media, some of them are already clapping back and are, getting off of platforms and are, returning to the woods. But I don't think that's sustainable because of the way that everything else has gone online, like news, like entertainment, like our education. And so it's a very difficult thing, but if you are raised with this idea that the whole world is watching you, it can be very corrosive to the freedom of your own spirit, right? And your ability to want to be goofy and funny and controversial and honest or emotional even. And what's worse than a video of you crying? A few weddings, and I'm like, oh no. I'm like, don't put that online, please. But yeah, I think that that's an important issue that you've raised, and I think that psychology needs to really attend to it. And I think in our media literacy, we also need to teach that one may be on social media, but it's not a prerequisite for being social.
Yeah. And some kids don't care that much about it. I think that's also, this idea that every kid is on their screen all day long is just not true.
Yeah.
I've got, of my 3 kids, like 2 of them are never on social media ever. And, even my 14-year-old is doesn't have most of so he just doesn't care. He loves his Discord servers because all his buddies are on it.
Yeah.
It's very pragmatic, but they're not actually addicted to their technology. So, I think there's an issues where that is happening, obviously, but I don't think it's as pervasive as we've been told. You have had a question for a while. We should let everyone go.
Oh, they're coming to get you, Alex.
It's about time, too. Because I said bad things about that movie.
Yeah.
So my name's Austin, and I have sort of a kind of meta question about this Q&A. So you guys have talked a lot about the importance of discussion within these worlds and how there's no clear answer to these things. Why do you think events like this and going to colleges and talking to people. And I've been to many events like this at a Q&As with like directors or whatever, but there's not normally experts as well that are there to have this discussion, not just about the technical side of the film, but what the film's about. So like, why do you think it's important to have people here to talk about this and talk with your audience and like kind of fuel this discussion, especially for younger generations?
It's a great question. When I made this movie, I genuinely thought nobody under 30 was going to want to watch it. It wasn't why I made it. It was just sort of something in the back of my mind. Remember you talked about having really bad instincts? So I really thought that most of the younger generation is so tapped into technology already that what did they really need, what were they going to really feel they needed from sort of an older person's contextualizing of their world. We presented the movie at Tribeca, and we had an incredible theatrical experience. There were a lot of younger people there, and then we started moving the film in festivals into high schools right out of the gate from Tribeca. This is well over a year ago. We toured high schools all over Europe for that entire summer, high schools all over the Eastern Seaboard for that summer. And I was doing Q&As wherever I could. I call them kids, they're not all kids, like people your age and younger were on fire, like super hungry for information, lot of understanding of the context. They were discussions, they weren't, and this is what I don't like about Q&As, it wasn't like me pontificating, it's like, that's me pontificating for now, like you don't need me to do it again, you just sat through 90 minutes of it, right? So it was this idea of an exchange, right, between sort of the filmmaker, us, and the audience. But what was lacking from that, and we started to pick up after that, we took the film to the Disinformation Summit at Cambridge University in England this summer, and we've been touring with panels like this since then, because I think it's really important for that to plug into that exchange people who really have legitimate expertise, long-standing expertise in these issues. I really consider myself, I'm a layman. I have access and interest. And as a doc filmmaker, I'm always seeking out people who know way more than I do. And I never approach these subjects going, I know what there is. I have the opposite. I'm like, I want to know more, but I also want to be confounded and confused and have questions when I come out the other end. So it's been about an exchange. And I also think that the way forward is about all of this working together, kind of your generation, our generation. There's a lot to be said for expertise of like, just these women here and other people that we've had on our panels that have like kind of not to toot your horns, but world leading expertise in a very complicated area. So plugging that into this discourse, I think, is really important.
Take the mic. So we're going to wrap up with one last hurrah here for wanted to ask just a really easy question, like how do we fix it, and like what your...
Sure. Oh, that's super easy, yeah.
No, I'm fucking with you. What I do want to know though is not in a techno nostalgia way, but in a more positive sense. What was your favorite thing about the internet and kept you going back? Do you want me to start?
I know mine.
Okay.
Super easy.
Okay, you go first.
Okay,
then.
mine was Napster. I'd been online for probably 15 years by then. And Napster was I was old enough that I didn't need to use it to steal music. The record company had swindled me into buying 5 different versions of every album I liked already on cassette, vinyl, you name it, CD. But it was the community that I knew was coming that had not yet come. You had these tiny little online communities. Then suddenly you had 70 million simultaneous users, and like you could open whatever part of your hard drive you wanted to them. So I could go look at people's like dissertations and like their poetry and like their music, their art, their photography. They could do the same with me. Like it was this incredibly democratized exchange on this massive level. I was a total Napster devotee. I would literally spend my weekends. I had an office in London. I'd go in when no one was there. I would log every computer in the office. There were like 25 of them
Down,
onto
down,
Napster. And I would just create like one massive daisy chain system. And I was just on it all weekend long. And it was I still have super close friends from that community. So, and it's gone, like there's nothing like
I
it.
know.
I mean, that's the only thing about the internet I miss is Napster was this very idiosyncratic moment in time that is completely it's not replicatable.
Yeah, that's true. Eleni?
Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation. So I know I mentioned Internet Archive as a place that archives the world, but Wikipedia does a job that I think nobody else has been able to do, and they've been able to keep going. And in fact, they're taking from museums, so they're working with cultural heritage institutions to take the materials they've digitized and make them linked through linked data more accessible for folks. So I'm just so stoked about
Yeah,
that.
Wikipedia is
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
So first, I want to say that you're not just a layperson. I mean,
Hell
you don't
no.
make like movies over and over about different aspects of tech, and not really have like a ton of expertise. And I just admire that you're not jumping from one thing to the next. You know, there's a kind of consistency in terms of returning to the issue of technology, but doing it over 15 years also just gives you a certain type of perspective than, if you just jump once. So I just wanted to say that, because I do really appreciate that as a filmmaker. Gosh, I mean, in terms of what I love about the internet, I like the types of conversations. Well, I love having face-to-face conversations, and that's why I love being a professor. I get a total high, going into a class and having a conversation with my students. But I also totally love the types of conversations I've had online, whether it's on Discord-like places like IRC with computer hackers, where you have 7 people talking at once, and there's these multiple threads, and it's completely kind of exhilarating. And I think Twitter is sort of similar to that, even though it's like dumpster fire right now.
Yeah.
And I particularly love, for better or for worse, real-time events and commenting on real-time events on
That's
Twitter.
amazing.
You feel
Yeah.
like you're part of history in the making, I guess. And dog videos, dog images. I mean,
Represent the
Instagram algorithm knows me because I follow so many dogs on Instagram.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, my gateway drug was very much Napster and SoulSeek and downloading MP3s that I still have in my phone to this day.
No way.
And finding out about bands that 6 kids in London listen to.
Yeah.
Right? It was a basement tape that someone had made that they uploaded, and it just was so perfect at the time. Even some of the early Bright Eyes demos were only easy to get online, and I just love that, sharing music and just in the way that you would share a mixtape with a friend.
Yeah.
But I will say the most exciting time I was ever online was at the birth of the Occupy movement on Twitter,
Yeah.
and I felt so connected to activists all over the world. And over the course of the next 2 years, I went and met them. So I went to Barcelona, and I went all over the United States and met people that believed in the things I believed in, like that banks shouldn't rule everything. And it was a time where people were very optimistic about social platforms upending representative democracy as we know it and bringing in a kind of horizontal democracy where people represented themselves. And of course, that techno-utopian vision was completely shattered by the time I was looking at counter movements to what was happening in Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, and how the internet, these tools are not neutral, but they're crucial for organizing. And just as well as you can organize a birthday party or throw a concert or create a protest as big as the Women's March, people who organize hate, harassment, and incitement are using the same tools, right? And so the point isn't to come up with a content agnostic set of policies and only target fraud and grift. The point is to organize your people and keep an eye on them and keep your communities safe.
Yeah.
And I still love the internet and some social media because of that fact.
Yep.
So it's been a great night, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much to
Yeah.
be you, to all of you.
Thank
Thank you.
Alex said he will come back someday.
I'll come back someday.